The next item is item number 9, an application for a certificate of appropriateness in the Borough of Manhattan, docket number 16-1604, block 1496, lot 41, 1010 Park Avenue, also known as 1010 to 1012 Park Avenue, in the Park Avenue Historic District. An annex to a Gothic Revival-style church designed by Marilyn Holmgren and built in 1960. The application is to demolish the building and construct a new building. This was heard at the public hearing of October 21st, 2014, and December 2nd, 2014.
Jared, let's just wait for me, of course.
Are you in?
No.
That expression you used earlier today. Check.
Commissioners, good morning. I'm Jared Knowles, Preservation staff. This is 1010 Park Avenue, which is located on the southwest corner of Park Avenue and East 85th Street, Park Avenue Historic District. The proposal was originally presented at the public hearing of October 7th, 2014, and called for demolishing the 1960 to 63 annex and constructing a new residential building and creating a barrier-free access door into the church on the East 85th Street elevation. At that time, the Commission heard testimony and requested the applicants return with more information. At the public meeting of December 2nd, 2014, the applicant responded to public testimony and your initial comments. The majority of the commissioners at that time requested the applicant restudy specific aspects of the design, including retaining some part of the annex facade, incorporation of a setback on the facade of the new building, a review of the views of the church and specifically of the steeple, and reduction in the overall height and setbacks of the new building. So the applicants are back today. Paul Salvo will start us.
Reopen the hearing.
Thank you, Jared. Madam Chair, members of the commission, Paul Selver, I'm a member of Kramer Levin, Naftalis, and Frankel, and we are Land Use Council to the Park Avenue Christian Church. Our focus today is on the changes that have been made to the design of the proposed building to address the concerns expressed by the commission at its last public meeting. Jack Beyer and his colleague Michael Whetstone will present those changes, and they will explain why we believe that the proposed development is within the continuum of solutions that are appropriate for the Park Avenue Historic District as a matter of architecture and for the sanctuary as a matter of preservation. They will also describe and illustrate the studies that they did in an effort to determine whether it was possible to retain any of the existing annex facade and still lay out interior spaces that were both legally compliant and marketable. Before they start, I just want to make one comment on the suggestion by 1000 Park Avenue that there is a viable development solution here that would offer a handsome return to the church within the current building envelope. I think we believe that that's speculation. In addition, in the real world, it's unacceptable to the church because rather than giving the church 12,500 square feet of needed program space adjacent to its sanctuary, it offers nothing. It's also unacceptable to Extel, and we believe it would be unacceptable to any developer because both the size of the project and the quality of the apartments cannot even come close to justifying the substantial risk associated with its development. Appropriate is defined in the dictionary as something that is, quote, right or suited for some purpose or situation, end quote. It is treated under the landmarks law as a multifaceted criteria, one with many nuances and no do's and don'ts. It is a determination made on a case-by-case basis, and its goal is to ensure that the work being permitted is, and I'll quote again, consistent with the effectuation of the purposes of the landmarks law, end quote. We believe that the proposed development today is consistent with and will achieve the purposes of the landmarks law by contributing architecturally to the Park Avenue Historic District and by preserving the church's beautiful sanctuary. It is well within the continuum of appropriateness. We urge you to approve it, and we hope that you will do so. Thank you very much. Jack?
Michael Whetstone will join me in giving you an overview of what we're going to be doing today. We have three parts to our presentation. A quick recap of what happened at our last hearing on December 2nd. A description of our proposed new design. And a very detailed analysis of our attempt to retain the fragment of the only remaining fragment of the original building. And we will describe to you that in detail what we want at the end of our presentation. But we want you to evaluate what we're doing based on the appropriateness and making a case through our new design. The first thing is that the commission decided that it would be inappropriate to set the building back at the last hearing, to make way for the fragment and set the tower back behind the fragment. You remember that? That was the decision you recommended, that we go with the existing zoning, that we have a street wall that complies with the zoning, but that we should evaluate the opportunities that that zoning permits us to do recesses in the facade. Now, am I incorrect in making that statement?
I think it was more sort of a recognition that it would be contrary to the zoning and contrary to, I think, the historic patterns of apartment buildings in and of itself on Park Avenue. So, but I don't think it was necessarily saying that you can't do it. It was that we recognized that the zoning and public policy from that perspective was trying to get the building at the street line.
Okay, I stand corrected. Thank you. In evolving the design and fitting within the existing zoning, we determined that we are able to create a recess and still maintain the street wall, a recess and the street wall, and conform to the zoning. We are permitted to have as much as 50% of the facade in recess. We have chosen to do less than 50% for architectural design reasons. But we have a substantial recess, 21 feet actually from the edge of the church to the place of the street wall. And the reason for our locating the recess here is to make it possible to see a more complete picture, three-dimensionally, of the church from the sidewalk on the south side, from the south, on both sides of Park Avenue. So this is the major gesture with regard to zoning and massing, and that we believe that the appropriateness of this gesture gives an opportunity to honor the church more than the previous design showed. The second part of the commentary from the commission, and listening to the testimony, was the base. And that you indicated that it was important to acknowledge and reflect in the design the history and the ensemble of the church campus, so to speak, as it might be reflected on the exterior design of the building. So with that, we show you the site plan of the new building next to the church. And this is shown as a legal recess, 6 feet deep, 16 feet long on the building side, and 21 feet away from the wall of the church. And this occurs at the 4th floor. These two illustrations, one from the north and one from the southeast, show you the basic idea of creating a building that reflects the comments from the commission, and particularly in its massing, defers to the three-dimensional characteristics of the church on Park Avenue. This is a key view of that condition, and to us is created simply by this allowable recess. Please note that the recess is not down the middle of the building, which would be permitted from a zoning point of view. It is located roughly in 1/3, 2/3, because of the articulation and the design of the fenestration and the columns and the piers that create what we think is a very important sympathetic relationship of fenestration, proportion, height, and width to our neighboring building, which in our judgment is as important a consideration in this evaluation by you as the church is. Because we believe that this composition of our neighboring building, our new building, and the church is a significant block front on Park Avenue. You can see from this rendering that the idea of the ensemble, the notion of this being a church precinct from property line on 85th Street, property line on Park Avenue, is a central feature of this design. And we do it through a series of design techniques, not, as you can see, trying to replicate or prop up the fragment of the facade that's there. It's a classic design challenge to any architect dealing with restoration when you're putting something new next to something historic. You are always dealing with an interpretation of how that works. You're dealing with contemporary architecture sympathetic to its historic setting. This is what we're trying to do, and I hope that you will evaluate us on that premise as opposed to not necessarily saving something that's very difficult to fit into the fabric of our building. So with this idea, what am I doing here now? With this idea, we have a facade that has a series of individual components at the base, which clearly is inspired not only by the existing church, but by the memory of the fragment that's there today. Which is to say that we have selected the schist stone. We will salvage that. We will reuse the original stone in the new facade. And where we do not have enough, and we probably may not have enough, we know that there are quarries that have that exact stone, so that this, unlike the present 1963 renovation, where the stone selected, and I'll show you that again, for the piece that is not original, is a poor mismatch, is a poor match. We will have a very good one. So that the idea of the material continuing as a three-dimensional enclosure to what was a campus is the first step in terms of appropriate design with regard to the new construction relating to the church. The second gesture, of course, is the idea of this piece, which in the original has a gable end. But that piece stands out as an important component of the original design, the one that's there. And this portion of the building is set back at this point, but here it's set back only a few inches, but the material changes. So there's clearly a differentiation between the authenticity of what is there, not what this is, but what is there today, and the separation of it from the church. It also relates vertically to the setbacks that we have honoring the corner of the church. Next. This is a view further from the north and illustrating the massing at the top and the relationship of the top to its neighbor. We have set back in accordance with the zoning at just under 150 feet. We have a cornice line that wraps around to a point not continuing along the north facade, setting back 10 feet in accordance with the zoning, continuing a band course at this elevation, but not continuing it the entire length of the facade, because one of the considerations or determinations by the commission was that in our first design we made too much of a design statement on what is the south facade of the building. Next, we see the relationship of the existing composition, 1000 Park Avenue, the annex and the church, and our proposal. Unfortunately, the trees on the existing really cover this up. We have a drawing of that coming up later, but our notion is that the sidewalk experience, the experience of the pedestrian, is very important in the idea of continuing the notion of the church ensemble. And we have created an entrance which is another element of the existing facade that we intend to reuse. So we intend to, instead of keeping the entire fragment, we're taking pieces of it and putting it into the building where we think it's appropriate. The first was the stone that we described, and the second is at the entrance, which we'll describe in detail. This is a view of the existing building and a view of our proposed building. You can see that this line picks up the line of a strong band course in our neighboring building, not unlike where the existing bay windows are located. So our objective is not to recreate this or even imply that this is it's similar to this existing building. It's an interpretation of it that we feel is sympathetic. You'll notice that the detailing of this building has highlighted terracotta. Our base building has highlighted limestone, which is a similar color. It's in the same color palette as the church, and is the base building tower color. Next. In a close-up, you will see the relationship in section, which is taken through here, of the recess to the church. What's important here is that you are seeing more than we had previously proposed in our original design. We're seeing the stone returning, and we have decided to place a vertical glass window, as well as a horizontal skylight above the fourth floor to permit more light coming into the courtyard where the stained glass windows are located. We have purposely continued the stone pier vertically. We have a expression of a cornice line at this point relating to our neighbor and relating to the band coursing on the church. And again, by using stone and limestone, we are able to create a sense of tracery, which is limestone fenestration elements, not just metal elements, that are in the existing building that we are creating on the 2 floors above the ground floor. We have selected the entrance in the existing annex as an appropriate element, even though it isn't original. We've selected it because we think it is of value, it was thoughtfully designed, and works very well as our entrance. It has 9 bays of transom limestone. We are fitting that into 7 bays of transom limestone and making an entrance statement that will be very familiar to the neighbors around who are walking by, as being something that recalls what was there, just as we are using the stone. So these 2 gestures, the stone and the entrance, are our design techniques for connecting our design to the history of the campus. Next. On the upper floors, we have a setback at this location, 10 feet, and then a 2-story addition at the top, not addition, 2-story extension at the top. This illustrates the fact that the facade design facing Park Avenue has more elaborate articulation, similar to our neighbor. As we return facing the church, we're creating a more neutral pattern with less 3-dimensional articulation so that the principal facade is highlighted. This is an illustration of how our glazing and light skylight permits light to come into the courtyard. This is in relationship to the existing building. And you can see our idea. This is we call it fragment. This is the original piece of fragment. And how our attempt to create a sympathetic continuity of the materials and the proportions and the details of the church to the base of our building, but in a contemporary, modern way, not trying to replicate what was there. The skylight, this is a section through the courtyard between the church and the new building. This is a section looking the other way through the existing building dotted in red. This is the existing profile. Our our design creates a space between the church and our building at the point of the street, so there's more light coming in to our courtyard. And this illustrates the idea of the glass window at this point. And we discussed this the last time, which is the rear composition of the apse of the church and the rear facade of our proposed building, where we, due to setting the building back over 33 feet, compared to the existing building going right to the property line, we create the opportunity for light to penetrate into the beautiful stained glass windows that is covered up today, that are covered up today.
Can I ask a question on that point? 33.33 feet, is that because of the change in zone?
Yes.
And what would have been bad if you went over that? What would have happened if you chose to go
If you
further?
could go to 30,
Right.
but then there would have been a zoning mismatch, because this is, the 33 feet is the zoning change. So it was easier for us to just simply do the 33 feet.
Meaning that after, beyond 33 feet, you were in another zoning district, is that correct? In the R8?
The building would have had to have been lower, right? It would have to have stopped at a lower point.
Yeah, can I clarify?
Michael West,
Michael Wilson, Urban Development. So that this is a corner lot, and the rear yard is actually from this side, from 85th Street. So the 30 feet rear yard is measured from the back this way. So it would have permitted a sort of funny extension over here, the little tail, but that didn't seem worth it, and would have blocked light to the church. So the rear yard is measured 30 feet in that way.
Got it, thanks.
next. Just quickly about windows, and as the previous illustrations showed, we're attempting to have proportions of windows very similar to our neighbors, and we have windows that have aluminum frames, clear glass, it's a very dark gray frame, and we have those that have tracery, which is to say stone horizontal bands in the base of the new building, as I pointed out earlier. The materials, we're using the salvage stone from the original building, new stone to match where needed. We're using limestone panels, cladding, on the upper reaches of the building.
Both north
Similar-
and both sides that are visible from the street.
Yes. South and west. And matching as close as we can to the limestone on the church. We're using clear glass, the metal frames for the windows, and a rubbed oil bronze, which will make it more like statuary bronze, darker, and a buff-colored brick for the west facade and the west facade. The elevation, looking at the building ensemble from 84 all the way to 1020 Park Avenue. This is a very good description graphically of why we do not have the building cut half and half, which the zoning would permit. It's more like a third, two-thirds, so that the recess can highlight, by being a recess, the corner of the church, but also the part that's proud and flush with the street wall relates to our interpretation of the gabled fragment The fenestration is different than in the fragment, and we'll explain that in the last piece of our presentation. But it relates well, we think, to our new building and to our neighbors. And this is the new entrance. This is the north elevation. Next. This is the west elevation. This is actually a piece of the courtyard elevation. Two sections, one through the new construction where we're creating a significant amount of program space, as you know, for the church. This is a section through the courtyard. This is a section the other way. And what do we have next, Michael? Plans. Do you want me to go through the plans?
No, I don't think we need that,
Okay, you've
but
seen
maybe
that.
you can focus on just the
Third part.
Yes, third part.
So the third part of our presentation is an analysis of how we attempted to figure out how to use the fragment in our design. And Michael Whetstone, who did this work, including all the work, most of the work we've just seen, will explain that. You have it.
Thanks very much. So we did take a good hard look at how we might reuse some of the facade, and we just wanted to show you some of the practical difficulties that we came up with. So first on the left is the existing elevation as it is now, and we really discovered that there's two major limitations to this facade which were giving us trouble. One is that the windows are too small for the program inside, for which there are minimum sizes of windows for a fairly deep residential building. And the second is the quite small floor-to-floor heights of only 10 feet on the second and third floor, which don't fit the program, but I will illustrate that in detail. So on the right, you can see the proposed facade. If we were to reuse the entire annex facade, what would we have to do to it to change it? So the first is, assuming that we would want to keep the bay window as the significant feature intact, we would have to make up for it by having huge windows on the right to get to the correct glass area to serve the floor plan. And those windows are really maximum pieces of glass, and they're awkwardly proportioned, but that's really the amount of glass that we would need on the second and third floor. We also have the problem of the existing building has one entrance, but for a multi-function building with a church facility and a residential building, we need several doors, so we would need to add a door on the far left and far right in addition to the main entrance. And then you can see on the fourth floor in the gable of that original facade fragment, that little tiny window is really too small to serve anything and would need to be significantly enlarged to serve as a window just for a bedroom. And I just want to show the floor plans. This is the second floor plan. Because, for zoning reasons, because part of this project is in the R8B district, we have to do a quality housing program for Chapter 28 of the zoning, which means that we have to have a large tenant recreation space. We can't put it on the roof because it's all mechanical equipment. It's a very narrow building. So we are showing our required tenant recreation space, which requires windows, on the second floor. And what I've done here, you can see the amount of required tenant space that's is for zoning in gray. The red line is how much of that space we could use if we were using the existing windows that are on the second floor. And the blue line shows our shortfall. So we have to provide enough windows at that 10% dual glass area to serve that whole area, hence that gigantic window that you saw on the second floor. And the problem is similar when we go to the third floor, where we have an apartment with a living room fronting Park Avenue, and we can only make a living room 14 feet deep, having to fill a whole lot of space at the rear of the building that would not be able to be served by windows. That becomes a difficulty as well. And then similarly, looking at bedrooms on this third floor, there's a very limited amount of area that you can actually use for that little window in the dormer. And then just to illustrate the problem with floor-to-floor heights. So we have on the far left our proposed building section where we have a 12-foot floor-to-floor height for the second and third floor. And it's the most critical on that tenant amenity space, which is a zoning requirement, which is a large multi-use space for tenants, and it needs to be a space with mechanical ventilation and overhead ductwork. And we find, and this is in the middle, a section of how it would look if we were able to reuse the fragment in the bay window. We get down to 10-foot floor-to-floor heights, And given the thickness of our long span slab across the width of the building and dropped ductwork, we end up with only 7 feet of headroom in that area. And we come to similar but not as great problems on the residential floor and the third floor, but it's really that second floor becomes very difficult with the limited floor-to-floor height. And then this three-dimensional view just illustrates how, and we think it's very odd to have a roof gable engaged in a wall rising above it. So this is just a comparison of, on the left, our proposed elevation, and on the right, the idea of reusing the annex facade. And we find that the windows are strange and not in balance, because we're balancing the gigantic windows on the right with the existing windows on the left. And there's that funny piece with the gable on the top. But we did want to just look at a couple of other ideas, one of which is on the far left. Well, what if we got rid of the gable and just kept a flat roof piece, because that gable engaging the wall is very, very odd. What would it look like if we kept that piece? And then if we were to perhaps take the whole bay window apart and stretch it to fit the floor-to-floor heights, as you can see on the right, what would it look like if we did that? The window situation is not as bad when we go to 12-foot floor-to-floor heights. We can narrow the windows down a little bit, but we still have that same problem. And then perhaps a bigger problem of really compromising the integrity of that fragmented piece. So this is just a comparison of these different ideas, what it would do to that one fragment. At the very minimum, we would have to enlarge the window in the gable and put in that door, and then the two other ideas of modifying it further. But I guess the question becomes, at what point are we not saving enough to make it really say that we're keeping the integrity of reusing that piece? So
Perhaps just in summing up.
Yes.
You might want to just compare what we just went through, and we think carefully, to try to save the fragment, which we determined wasn't worth it, and what we have instead is an interpretation of what was there, as opposed to an attempt to literally save what was there. And we believe that this is an appropriate action in that you determined that the annex was not a contributing building. It was a no-style building. So we would be doing really extraordinary handstands to save something that you have determined not to be contributing to the district. So I conclude with that, and
Okay. All right.
here to answer questions.
Thank you, Jack. Questions? Yes, Ivy?
So I do want to, because I was among those who thought, or maybe singularly, thought that the first premise, which is that the new building, your premise, that the new building needed to be at the street wall, I rejected that in favor of keeping the annex depth, let's say whatever that is, and then setting back the new building. So I just want to ask one more time about that, because I just want, additionally, I just, every time you make a presentation, it's so thorough and it's so exceptional, and all of your work every time I just think is remarkable in addressing the concerns. I'm very happy to see the schist, the building turn the corner, and the fact that you've attempted to do that. I know from the vantage point of a sort of contemporary architecture, if we were to have a discussion about what that is, I don't know that we'd be able to really identify it. Like, what is that we're seeing there, right? And we'd have a little bit of difficulty with it, but still, I think that the campus dimension of the church was critical. But so, if you could just answer the question, Chair, as well as architect, about this question of the street wall. To what extent would modification be able to be made to the zoning limitation?
All right. So, and I read it up recently, but I think I'm pretty confident about it, that the Special Park Improvement District, I believe, was adopted in the 70s. And part of that was, I think it even predates, contextual zoning. And it was one of the areas where it was very critical that the context speaks to the issue of street walls. So the street wall, and again, like contextual zoning, I don't know if Paul can speak to that, but contextual zoning has now become very commonplace, where the standards are street wall buildings, usually fairly restrictive, which is build at the street line, build 75% or build 80%, that may vary by district, go to a certain height as a minimum and go to a maximum height, and then you set back and then you have a overall building height. The Park Avenue district had put in place that you have to have a street wall, which is 125 to 150 feet. That came out of the context of development along Park Avenue, primarily apartment buildings. And if you walk up and down apartment building, Park Avenue, you will see that it's very, very consistent. So from a public policy zoning standpoint, predating our historic district, which took place actually in 2014, there was an overriding agreement from the policymakers that you needed a building that was at the street line, going to 125 to 150 feet, because that was, in fact, the historic sort of datum of the buildings that developed during the period, I think, in the 10s and 20s or something, maybe further than that. That also comes out of, this 1960s zoning, which established the heights of buildings and street walls based on the width of the streets. And you have Park Avenue, which is approximately 120 feet, so there must be some relationship to that. So just getting back to I think the more nitty-gritty of this, it's like, what is the flexibility that the Park Avenue, Special Park Avenue Improvement District allows, is that it requires you to put the street wall at the street line for the full length, and have a minimum street wall height of 125 feet and a maximum street wall height of 150 feet. The exception to that is, it's not that you can't, that you have, the exception of eroding from the street wall is through the recess provision. And the recess provision allows you to have a recess to the maximum depth of 6 feet. Okay, so 20 feet is not within. So 6 feet is your maximum depth. And the extent, or so the depth is 6 feet, the width along the street wall is limited to 50%. So if the street wall of this building or along the lot is 45 feet, then the maximum width of that recess doesn't have to be at one place, it could be broken up. But that aggregate cannot be greater than, in the case of 45 feet, it'll be 27 feet, 27 and a half feet. So that's essentially the regulations that govern street walls.
Right, those are the regulations.
Yeah.
I'm asking, given the fact that this rector is here and the annex exists and it has a roof and...
Right, so the issue of whether you grandfather a piece, and I'm going to ask the applicants to sort of speak to that issue, because it's based on what is required to meet the regulations, and it's largely based on, I think, what is considered a development, but maybe the architects or Mr. Southwick can just speak to that. About, I think the question is, if you retained this portion and it was the existing building, what would it mean in terms of being able to erode the street wall?
So the Park Avenue zoning defines a development as being either a new building or an enlargement that increases lot coverage. Those are the two relevant definitions for these purposes. I believe that because this building is integrated with the church, it's technically an enlargement rather than a new development. But it is also an enlargement which has to increase lot coverage. And the lot coverage that's relevant is the lot coverage within the Park Avenue district. So that the fact that we're providing additional open space in the R8B that wasn't there doesn't matter, because zoning applies within each district.
on that same line, so what you're saying is that you're really measuring not the dimension of the existing building, but you're dimensioning the from the corner to the end. So then, wouldn't the 50% not be 22 and a half, but be half of the entire frontage, which is 97 and a half?
It's
If one were to do a recess quantity, would it be then half of 97, or half of 100, or half of
I
45?
believe, I really want to look at this, because you quote the zoning off the top of your head at your peril, but I believe that it's the front building wall of the development. And the development here is the enlarged portion of the building, which is the new construction. And the 50% applies to that portion of the building, I believe, and we can double check that. But the reason that we are increasing lot coverage is because in order to resolve an issue of distance between buildings, which applies when you have a residential building and another building on the same zoning lot, and here we would have what are considered for zoning purposes to be two buildings. We are providing the covered space, the greenhouse, if you will, between the two buildings, and that adds to the lot coverage that's already there today, and that brings us into being a development.
Is considered one or two zoning lots?
This is considered one zoning lot. Is there a question? I mean, I'm happy to try to...
Zoning's rather arcane, but the point being that it's triggered because of the fact that even its enlargement, it exceeds the lot coverage, and once you exceed the lot coverage, you're governed by the rules for development. I think, I mean, the intent is that at a certain size and square footage, the intervention is enough for you to actually then start following the rules, because it favors the policy that if it's significant, you should follow the new rules.
An increased height does not make up for smaller lot coverage.
No, and actually, interestingly enough, you'd have the same problem even if you were to set back the front building wall, because the lot coverage that's relevant kicks in at 23 feet above curb level, above the street level, so that anything above 23 feet that's covered becomes lot coverage. And even if you were to save the very front of the existing facade and set the building back,
Yeah.
you'd still have the same lot coverage that we have with this building.
Right, I think your point is that even if, let's say, if you reduce the lot coverage, could you increase the height?
Yeah.
And you cannot, because, I mean, in this case, you won't be able to, because they have an overall height limit. All right, okay, other questions? Are there any other questions?
So are we saying that zoning would prevent us from having, from keeping the old dragnet and having space between it and the new building, right? You're saying that if you kept it, you could not have any space between the front of that dragnet and the building part that starts at the fourth floor, the third floor, fourth floor.
You know, I think part of the answer to that question is that I don't think you could. I won't say that 1,000% here. But what you would have is you'd have terrible problems with legal windows. Because in order to have a legal window qualifies to give light to a habitable room, you need to have a distance of at least 30 feet between that window and the nearest wall. And therefore, if you were to have a setback of less than 30 feet from the existing wall, you would only get credit for the openings that were in the front wall, not the openings that were in the back wall. So you'd have the same habitable room problem that arises when you keep the existing facade, as shown by Michael.
Yes.
I had a few questions, I guess, for the architect. First, You talked about the church precinct as being the most important, one of the most important things you were trying to work into the design. Can you help me understand what your intention is with the relationship of the schist at the base with the limestone above, both from this facade and as viewed from the north? How is that meant to integrate with the church precinct as opposed to, let's say, the neighbor to the south?
Well, we are carrying this height because it's the height that is there. It's not exactly that height because we're relating it to our dimensions, but it's a interpretation of a well, let's go to the previous shot. Okay, so this is where we stop the stone. Naturally, because we are relating to the entire ensemble of the block, it goes from this point all the way around to its neighboring building on 85th Street. This joint is new. Michael, this is new, right? This is new.
Yeah, there's an existing side buttress of the church, which is defined by the top of that limestone, and we are building above that.
Yeah.
Just as the annex, same relationship that the annex has, it kind of steps over the side.
What I was asking, though, I guess, is what do you see as the relationship between the schist base and your new building? Is your new building meant to relate to the schist base? And I understand where it occurs. I'm just asking, the schist is generally considered to be a kind of rustic, Gothic material and look, and the limestone is a very dressed, formal, proper look.
Okay, I understand.
Tell me how they relate to each other.
Well, historically, and Park Avenue is a good example of it, all of the Upper East Side, West Side, fairly monumental apartment buildings built at the same time as 1000. Often, although this, our neighbors is not an example of that, often have a change of stone or a change of material at a point not unlike what we have here. The changes vary significantly. They can be from say, a granite or a limestone to a brick. Sometimes they can start at a lower elevation. This is a little unusual, and I think it comes from, I think, a goal here. It comes from a goal of trying to, assuming the premise we're going to build something new, attempting to create a relationship of the new to the historic that isn't just a line between the two buildings, which was our first proposal, which you found too unsympathetic to the host church landmark. And we agreed with that. So this is perhaps somewhat more of a high contrast change than perhaps in other locations. But I feel that, this part of it is completely justified because that's the goal. Limestone. It's not necessarily rustic in its finish. It's a random ashes, so it's not coursed, and therefore it's a little bit more, it is more rustic. So, but the limestone, let's look at the larger picture, Michael. We feel the limestone is correct in a scenographic way. We have to look at the building in many ways. One, as a pedestrian, as a neighbor, as a person strolling on the sidewalk. Very often in New York, we have two different understandings of tall buildings. We can walk right by them and not even look up, and have an experience with storefronts and beautiful materials and whatever, stone, etc., and not realize that this building has a significant purpose in the larger picture of the New York skyline and the way it's perceived at a great distance. So we started, before we ended up with the stone base, we started with the limestone because we felt, for two major reasons, it was right. Number one, the principal reason is that it really set off the church. That a darker material would have not been appropriate, limestone being very elegant, and being a principal highlighting material in the church was correct. We think it still is correct. And secondly, in the street wall context of Park Avenue, it's a very, very comfortable material. So your question is a good one, but I think the answer, I hope, is correct, that the specifics of the site, which are so exciting because of the factors of restoration coming together with new construction, give us a slightly different solution than it would have been if we didn't have.
Okay, thanks. Also, tell me, you said that the neighbor and the relationship of your building to the neighboring building to the south was very important to you.
Yes.
Tell me how the height is appropriate in that regard, of the penthouses, of the setback. And also, in the same part of that question, I noticed in the section that the floor-to-floor heights in the two top penthouses were considerably taller than the rest of the building, and it looks like the top floor is as well. Can you help us understand why that's appropriate?
Well, there's two things. One is that we have a setback so that the cornice line you read, and you see it all the way along Park Avenue, even though there's many interruptions, there's a sense of a cornice line, is maintained. The setback of 10 feet is, we think, appropriate and not unlike many other setbacks along Park Avenue. So the issue is the height. The reason for the height on the two penthouse floors is because those are the most desirable, the most important, the most the highest valued real estate in the building. And naturally, the higher the ceiling in terms of its position in the building, the better the proportions. And don't forget that we're talking about some very sizable rooms facing Park Avenue. So it's a design issue, but certainly it's a
But from an appropriateness point of view, help me understand why that's an appropriate choice as opposed to a marketing choice.
Well, we think it's appropriate because of the significant number of buildings that have projections above a cornice line higher than ours. It's not as though our building is uniquely higher with this setback than others. We can show you that study we did, and certainly our neighbor just to the right, significantly higher.
Yeah, that's.
It's not as though we're unique. We are part of a Park Avenue panorama that isn't just one thing. Park Avenue isn't that way. Park Avenue is made up of a very significant variety of building types with heights and setbacks that vary, but the one overriding characteristic is that street wall.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that when we were discussing it last time, one of the things that we were trying to say, I think, is that that building, because it's beside the church and not on the corner, relates more to, or should relate more to, its block rather than the block across the street. Now, I understand it's the same height or close to the height as as the building across 85th. Right. So, and it just, when you just look at it from this perspective, without comparing it to the one next to it, comparing it to the one across the street, it does look scale-wise as if it's bigger than it needs to be. No. Okay, I guess what I'm saying is that I'm relating it to what's on that block, and that's the view from here. So I'm not looking down because you can't compare it down. And so if the top two floors were shorter, I think it would help. But I understand what you're saying, but I think what I'm saying is I'm comparing it to the block and looking at it that way. And the fact that it's not a corner building, it looks like it wants to be on the corner is what it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one quick statement in your question, which is that because whenever there's a setback, there's additional height needed for some structural transfers, we need 2 feet higher on the floor. So the 13th floor, which is right below the cornice, and the 15th floor, which is right below the penthouse, both need several feet for depth of beams to carry the setback and loads of what's above. That's the answer to the question.
So the point you were making is that even though it appears that there is greater floor-to-floor heights than the other portions of the building, but because of the structure, the clear heights are consistent with the other?
That's some of the reason, not all of the reason.
That's on the top.
Yeah, the top two
floor
floors.
before the setback, not on the 2 penthouses.
Oh, okay. The penthouse floors are.
Those are just built for marketing.
The 15th floor as well, because there's a setback to the mechanical.
Okay.
Just one more point about Roberta's comment. Similar to many other buildings we illustrated in one of our last presentations to you, which are structures adjacent to a church ensemble, the facade, even though it's not on the corner, but it's facing a mid-block or a party wall or a graveyard of the church, that facade is finished and in a way forms a facade that is like a corner building. And that to me is an important job of this design, that it isn't a party wall building. It isn't a mid-block side wall. It is a finished, important, contributing facade to the qualities of the historic district.
Right, and for that reason, I still think that, while you contend that the street wall and its zoning issues sort of trump the landmarks considerations of the church, I contend otherwise, that actually the church and the dimension that's granted by the roof of the annex should trump, and because it's an unusual situation. You get enough street wall at where the schist ends, and then you would, my sense is that it would be much more successful if you set the whole thing back and used that annexed depth for the functions that you talked about, maybe the more of the common spaces. But if we agree that there is there's nothing to be done about the zoning issues, then this, and as you say, the interpretation that you've provided, I think is reasonable.
Michael and then Dana?
Okay, a couple more quick questions.
Mr. Kass, we're not taking questions from the audience. I'm sorry. We're having a discussion with the applicant right now.
But the legal advice being given is incomplete and wrong. I just read it.
And submit something.
Yeah. Okay, let's just continue.
Okay, 2 quick questions. First of all, at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about the ADA access to the church, and we talked about possibility of, you're indicating no changes to that current proposal, leaving the new door cut in. And lastly, if you could go to the images that relate to the fragment, the proposal to sustain it. Great, thanks. Just any one of those, it doesn't matter. The issues that you pivot your analysis on have to do with light and air for the most part, as well as ceiling height for the fragment.
And there's the third exceedingly
egress door.
important point, which is the flush condition.
Right. Okay. Well, that's an aesthetic one, but my question to you is this: if you just eliminated, and I know this is real estate heresy to talk about reducing sellable square footage, but if you eliminated the third floor in that location and just made your rec room double height, would that alleviate the light and air and ceiling height problems? I mean, obviously the ceiling height problems. Would it alleviate the light and air problems?
In the
If you made the second,
mandatory...
right, if your rec room, instead of being 12 feet tall now, 10 feet tall then, with the beams coming out even lower, and with light and air problems, would the double heighting of that space make that space legal from a light and air point of view? Obviously, it would alleviate the ceiling height problem.
We'd have to look at that, but...
What do you think? It might? It's possible?
It might.
Okay. That's all.
Okay. Yes, Diana?
Yeah, just a quick, the last time you presented, if you could again just say how many buildings, because we were discussing the height, how many buildings within the district actually would be currently at about the height of your proposed building, to just put it in the context of that.
So we had identified 6 buildings that went well above the cornice height with additional floors that were approximately the height of our proposal or taller.
We have, we
Yeah.
probably have them in our...
I know you did a whole
Right.
presentation last time, so
Previous
thank you.
presentation.
We'd be happy to to maybe send you those
Yeah, I mean-
page numbers, they're in previous books.
Right, I think at the last presentation, that's what they showed us, that in fact, one of them is, I don't know, I feel like saying 235 feet. This is like a 210, is that correct? What's the height of this building? The height?
The height of the building, Michael, the exact height of the building, 142 to the, let's get the drawing out.
Sure.
That's 185?
Sir,
Okay.
Yours first, and then
thank you. What was the question, sir?
the height of our building.
The height of our building is 150 feet to the...
Right, the overall height,
And then 206 feet to the top of the screen wall, mechanical screen.
Okay.
210 feet to the top roof being the zoning height limit.
Okay.
298 to the mechanical penthouse roof.
206 feet to the top of the screen wall.
But the screen is not visible from the front. In your elevation, you don't show, you're stopping at the penthouse, right? You're not showing the screen on that elevation that we see.
Yeah, no, it's there. It's there. It's set
Oh,
back.
is it shown?
Yes.
Yeah, I think everything's on the
So it's
elevation.
150 feet to that setback, 182 feet 6 here, and then another 206 feet to the top of the screen wall. And that does show in all the drawings.
You want to look this,
Do you have the information on the other buildings that, and their heights?
Yeah, we know that 1020 Park Avenue
Yeah.
is 210 feet tall to that roof, plus the penthouse. And then we had determined that there were 5 other buildings besides 1020 Park Avenue, which were also had similar heights, 210 feet being the maximum, but we know within that range, a little bit lower.
and it's in one of our previous submissions, we can...
We had identified each one.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, Roberta?
In terms of that ADA access, could we just see it really fast one more time, just what that was?
Yeah, I think we don't have that slide
Okay.
completely, but,
I thought I saw a slide of the north facade, which shows the door.
oh, thank you.
Go back.
We do. You're absolutely right, yes, right here. So that was the idea that this door here is up several feet, and by having a small door located right over here, we can have a handicap lift directly inside. And we had shown the idea of a ramp instead, which would have to wrap around the balustrade of the stair and extend about 3 bays down the building. And I remember the discussion was...
Right. I know, Michael, that you had some concerns about that, and I guess the question is whether, having ramps and all this clutter on the street wall versus a fairly discreet entrance, it's...
We've
I mean,
seen,
yeah.
the reason I raised the issue
Yeah.
is because at several churches recently,
Yeah.
we've seen cases where the stairs are pushed out, the ramp comes nice in, no going around, and it looks like this, that that, you're talking about putting in a thing in front of the historic fabric that, granted, would not be the most beautiful thing on the planet, but would not disturb the historic fabric, versus this, which would irrevocably cut into it, not to mention on the interior. I would imagine that with the staff, they could arrive at a better solution than one which required the cutting of the building itself.
Well, I think we can ask them to work with staff on that. All right, are there any other questions? Okay, we can close the hearing then. I just want to note that we did receive a letter from elected officials regarding extending public hearings on this, and I just would like Mark to speak to this issue because somewhat unusual request. So,
the Commission's general practice, has always been that there's a public hearing for certificates of appropriateness, public testimony is taken, commissioners give comments, and if the commissioners do not act, they don't approve or deny the application, their comments are then taken by the applicant back to the drawing board, and they try to address those comments, and they come back at a public meeting. At the public meeting, there's no additional public testimony. The applicant is not required to go to the community board. It is seen as the comments were heard, and now we're in the design phase of dealing with the commissioner's comments. In a very, very few instances where the design is so radically changed that it's in all fairness deemed almost a new proposal, the commission has required an applicant to go back to the community board and reconsider. But those are the very dramatic changes where a building was proposed at 15 stories and now it's 10, or 20 stories now and 10, or completely different. This application is very much in consistent with all of our applications. The commissioners asked them to look at the height. The street wall issue has been something that's been back and forth. It was well testified to at the public hearing, and the issues of preserving or incorporating some portion of the fragments or recalling the historic relationship of the 1963 building and or the historic buildings is something that the commission heard and has directed them to consider. So there's nothing in the request by the commissioners, nothing in this proposal that would put it in that very, very small minority of applications that would be required to go back to the community board.
right, and I just want to note also in the spirit of trying to address not on this particular issue, but other sort of a broader issue about reiterations to proposals, because they come back. The Commission now, I think, allows all our material that comes from public meetings to be viewed by people, and as you know, we even take written testimony into the record, which is also sort of new, but to address that as well. All right, are there any other questions? Did I close the hearing? No, I'm closing the hearing now. Okay. All right. This is truly a very unique site, I think, and it really does require a sensitive and nuanced response. I think if we had a site which was sort of an infill site, the initial proposal would be completely appropriate. It really did meet, I think, the spirit, the historic character of Park Avenue, and I think it would be appropriate from all that context. But this site has different layers to it, and I think it poses a very intriguing challenge for the design team to try and address multiple goals in, I think, in a way that is seamless and not contrived and just doesn't work well. So it poses very, very interesting challenges, and I do believe that the proposal with the changes that they've come back achieves many aspects that make this appropriate, the design appropriate for the site as well as the district. It meets I believe, several objectives that the Commission would want to see in terms of its design, the massing of and scale of this project. And, we can tweak the things about whether the top 2 floors should be lowered. But I think, in general, the massing and scale of a street wall building, of street walls that relate completely to the datum of street walls, and even the addition or the setback and penthouses relates very much to the buildings in the district. So I think it achieves that. I think that it addresses and responds very sensitively to some very unique issues related to the site, which is the fact that it neighbors and is part of a lot which has an incredibly exquisite church and with certain material and fabric to it, and that the building or the site has a history to it, which even if the Commission decided each aspect it wasn't contributing, there is at least a historical line that the Commission felt should be somehow reflected. And I think that their approach that they've taken tries to address that. I think that it achieves it through creating that recess, which, many may think is a small recess, but if you actually look at all the renderings, I think that recess is very effective. I think it sets back, and it really does allow the church to reclaim its prominence at the corner. I think that the Commissioner's suggestions about trying to incorporate or integrate or evoke the fabric of the vestige into the design allows us to retain the memory of the site, I think, in a very nuanced way. I think the idea of doing it through interpretation versus literal actually works better. I think, it's an odd thing because this vestige is just a facade. It's not a building. It's just a facade. And trying to integrate that in a way into the building that actually works with the overall design is hard. And I think that their approach to look at this in a more sort of evocative manner, I think it has been in my mind, very successful. I think some of the other issues that were raised about the 2 facades, some of it is in details and including the ramp. I think those are things that can be worked out with staff. But when you look at this overall as a building in terms of its massing, in terms of its materials, in terms of its details, I think it's hard to say that this is not consistent with the character of the historic district, and I think that it is sensitive to the design of the church, and I think it's creative in its approach to recall the historic fabric and vestige and complex on the site. And I think what was mentioned by the architects is that this combination of design approach and massing really makes this building very unique to the site. This is not just a Park Avenue building. This is a Park Avenue building that derives its design from the specific, recognizing that there's a church and other, the parish house and an existing fragment of the site. Are there other comments or, yes, Diana?
Yeah, I think that I just want to go through quickly a few things, but I think first I do think that the applicant has been creative and has really tried to respond to the Commission's concerns. I think that the street wall issue is not for me so much about zoning restrictions, but about the character of the existing district and its historic context. And so I understand and appreciate why they're working to the street wall, and also, I think that their recess accomplishes respecting and opening up the views of the church, which is very important to me. I think that if they tried to do 50% of the street wall, that would have really negatively affected the design of the entire new building in a way that I would not have been comfortable with. So I'm fine with how they actually accomplished that. And I think that relating the relationship of the street wall of the lower design and the upper building does work well. I really didn't think, I still don't think that trying to preserve the entire fragment is something that I wasn't in favor of that. I think that's somewhat kind of facadism in this particular instance. And I think that using the material at the street wall and relating it, using that as a way of relating is a good gesture and interpretive way of trying to continue. What they've really done is give a sense at the street wall of the current church precinct or campus. It sort of extended the church precinct out to the street wall and along, rather than really trying to preserve, obviously, the parish house facade, the piece of it that was still there. So I think that actually is successful. I think that the design does relate well to the new building, and also continues a sense of relationship to the church and its a parish house and precinct. And I think that the doorway, using the doorway, was really a very nice gesture, actually, to try to pull things together more and make recognition to the historic structure. And there was some changes made to the sidewall to further simplify it, which again I think does have is good because it is a sidewall. At the same time, there is this issue that it is always, as long as we're going to preserve the church, it's always going to be there as a major building. So I actually can accept the greater height because it is acting somewhat as a corner building, although it is not a corner building. Again, we've got another situation. It is a corner building, and it's not a corner building because of the church being there, but kind of a backdrop to the church. So I actually could approve the height. So I actually can approve the application.
All right, Roberta, do you want to say something?
Okay, I think that this is a good try if we can't use the facade that's existing. I would think that this is the runner-up. But for me, I still think, I understand that there were several reasons presented why we can't use the facade of the building. I'm not trying to build, new buildings just based on facades of old buildings. And I think when we started talking about the parish house, what we were looking at was how to incorporate part of the building, not the whole building. And now we are, because of zoning or whatever, just talking about a facade, which in a sense doesn't mean as much. But I think that in terms of having a new facade that pays homage to another facade, that if that facade could be used, that's the answer that we want. And I understand that there were reasons given about floor-to-ceiling heights and what's behind it, but still, for me, I think that it's still possible to do that if the architects looked at it again in a different way. So I guess I'm saying that I still would want to see more information, because I think, for instance, what's behind the second floor now is a recreational space, but it didn't have to, I don't know if that has to be there. I guess I'm still thinking it's not completely nonsensical to have the actual facade. And so for me, that's where it is.
Other comments? Yes.
The big concern that was raised by the comments that we received from the public that I took to heart was the notion that you can't see the church as well after on that first round of proposals as you could from certain angles before then. And that issue, for me, is reduced to what I would call dimensionality, which is that the original proposal made the church look one-dimensional. And I realize that the current proposal doesn't give you as much of a view of that side of the church as you get now. And I don't think there's any proposal under which that will be the case. But I do think that the setback, minimal as it is, recreates that three-dimensionality of the church and gives you back a little piece of that view, but enough to make you feel like you're not looking at a non-dimensional flat one side of a building. I don't think there's a solution that gives you back the entire view, and unless we're prepared to say we'll reject any proposal, I don't think we can get to that.
So I think you're saying that,
I think I would vote in favor of it. I wish I could get back more of that view, but I don't think I can.
okay. Other comments? Yes, Michael?
I think that the recess is an improvement. I think that in the course of the presentation, I think the possibility was very strongly raised that the dimensionality of that recess is far from settled as being what it is. And I think that the choices about how big the recess could be are, I think if it's one zoning lot and it's one entity, then the facade is 100 feet long and the recess could be 50% of that. Not that it should be or anything like that, but I'm just saying that I think that the zoning is not quite as restrictive as it seems to be. I also think that it's worth asking the question whether, and I don't think the applicant answered the question, that to explain why, from a historic district point of view, a 30-foot tall 33-foot tall penthouse setback portion is historically appropriate. Now, it may be that there are other buildings in the neighborhood that go taller, but as we've talked back and forth, I think that, this is a kind of an unusual situation, and I don't think it would harm the project in any way, and I think that they could accomplish, with talking to staff, to reduce 16.5-foot floor-to-floor heights on the top two floors significantly to make the impact of the higher portion somewhat diminished. I think that this project in general is one in a series of poster children for the argument that landmarks and the zoning resolution should be much better integrated so that we don't feel that one must sacrifice historic appropriateness to inflexible zoning regulations. And there's already plenty of precedent for that there are regulations that do imply a connection between and an interplay between the two agencies, city planning and landmarks. And I think that this project would have been it would have given the development team much more freedom to do a project that was a more appropriate, better project without having to struggle with zoning. That said, I think that the project does meet my interpretation of appropriateness, though I think it could have been a lot better, and I would say that my vote would be a reluctant one, because I do think that there could have been solutions that would have been more appropriate, but I think that this is appropriate. I certainly would say that the ramp that we should not be cutting into a hole into the side of the building if that's avoidable.
Okay. Yes, any other?
Well, I think the recess and the schist are very helpful to the project. The 15th and 16th floor, if they were 16 feet now, if they were 14, but I think they've done a very nice job.
Adi? Okay, all right. Then I think we are ready to vote, and why don't we include conditions that would relate to the staff working with the applicants regarding to the maximum extent possible to reduce the penthouse floors. I think that would go a long way, and it doesn't have to be 16 feet. It can be lower. It can be, we can bring it down to 14, and I think, and also work with the staff to not include, to not create a new door within the church, but work with them in order to create a ramp system which would then be temporary, it can be removed at any point. And I know the staff has worked on these cases before, and they usually help with working with the hardware that's required, which is as sort of subtle and inobtrusive as possible. Does that seem okay? Anything else?
I think it might be the ramp. We may need to come back at some point if there's a ramp, a permanent ramp. I think just, are you saying that the staff
No, I'm saying that they can work, that I think the direction is that they do, because they've shown us a ramp, and to work with staff to see how, to what extent they can make it as minimum as possible.
Got it.
And then the hardware can be similar to other churches that we've done, which is very simple sort of railings to be the least obtrusive as possible. Okay? All right, John, would you like to read that? It's a long resolution.
In the matter of docket number 16-1604, 1010 Park Avenue, also known as 1010 to 1012 Park Avenue in the Park Avenue Historic District, Block 1496, Lot 41. Application is to demolish the building and construct a new building. I recommend approval with regard to the demolition of the annex, that the Commission previously determined, finding that the Commission previously determined that the 1960s annex building does not contribute to the historic district, and therefore a significant alteration or demolition will not detract from the church or the Park Avenue Historic District, that while the 1960s annex retains one bay of the original schist facade and incorporated new matching stone and a monumental door surround that recalled the historic Gothic Revival style, the setback portion of the building lacks design and architectural features, and a new development that relates to the streetscape and the church would reinforce the street wall and the sense of an integrated complex, and that fragments of the original church buttress will remain, and that the historic and modern schist and monumental door surround will be salvaged and incorporated into the new building. With regard to the construction of the new building, I recommend approval, finding that there is precedent for larger buildings juxtaposed against smaller institutional or religious buildings both in this district and throughout the city, and therefore the proposal to construct an apartment building on this site is consistent with the development patterns of the district and the city, that the height and massing of the proposed new building will fit within the variations of height and massing of buildings within the historic district, subject to working with the staff to reduce the heights of the penthouse floors. That creating a recess in the street wall adjacent to the historic church will break up the scale of the new building and recalls the original complex where the church was a prominent structure and affords expanded views of the volume of the sanctuary. That the tripartite arrangement of the facade with the base, shaft, and crown or penthouses reflects a typical pattern of facades built during the early and mid-20th century within the historic district. That the majority of the historic and 1960s schist and the monumental stone door surround will be salvaged and reused, that the proposed schist-clad three-story base and recess recalls in a subtly articulated contemporary way the recessed street wall of the original parish house and reinforces the character of the new building as recalling the historic complex of buildings. That the remnant of the buttress is successfully incorporated and expressed in the design of the new building's stone base. That the proposed light color material palette, contrasted with dark finished metal windows and painted ornamental metalwork, will relate to the historic diversity of material and color palettes throughout the historic district. That the simple, minimal, contemporary design and details of the proposed building reflects the historical use of carved and cast ornament on apartment buildings in the historic district, which was applied sparingly on speculatively built apartment buildings to enliven the elevations and highlight specific design elements. that the use of piers with limestone and terracotta ornament recalls the vertical emphasis found within the Gothic Revival-style church and on various apartment buildings built in the early and mid-20th century within the historic district. That the regular pattern of window openings within the masonry facades reflects the predominant punched window fenestration found on 20th century apartment buildings within the historic district. That the proposed glass-walled atrium between the new building and the church allows the masonry walls of the sanctuary to be more visible, further articulating the massing of the new building and how it is seen as part of a modern complex on the site. That the introduction of the glass-walled atrium along with the recessed stone-clad two-story window bay in the base of the new building reflects in a simplified contemporary expression the use of Gothic-style elements by Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson to articulate large facades and distinguish between bays and adjoining structures. That the simplified design of the north facade will be well integrated into the overall design of the building while retaining a secondary reading to the primary facade. And that for these reasons, the proposed new building will complement and enhance the special architectural and historic character of the streetscape and the Park Avenue Historic District. With regard to the installation of a new door on the north facade of the church, I recommend that the applicant work with staff to eliminate the need to cut into the existing wall of the church for handicapped access, and instead to work further on detailing a sympathetic ramp that minimizes the interference with the view of the facade on the 85th Street side.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we're good. Right, this application's been approved.
The door I was talking about is this door, of course, not this side.